Next, let's move on to the next session, namely the panel discussion and Q&A. So our moderator for this session is Dr. Korekawa. So Dr. Korekawa, over to you.
はい、ありがとうございます。パネルディスカッションを開始したいと思います。はい。すいません、ちょっと。はい。はい。まずですね、大変貴重なご講演をいただきました。まず最初にですね、このパネルディスカッションでは、お二人のキーノートスピーカーに対して質問をしたいというふうに考えております。私たちは過去数十年にわたり、移民政策における数々の大きな変化を目の当たりにしてきました。移民の急増と社会的分断に対する懸念というのは、民主主義社会において非常に大きな政治の原動力となっています。最初ディスカッションのこの第1ラウンドでは、この過去数十年間の民主主義社会におけるですね、移民政策の展開、こういったものを2人のキーノートスピーカーの方が、先生方がどのように見ているかということについて改めてお伺いしたいと思います。質問としてはですね、まずデハース先生とヨプケ先生にそれぞれお聞きします。質問を読み上げます。過去数十年間の民主主義社会における移民政策の最近の展開をどのようにご覧になっていますか。特にですね、2010年代以降、2016年以降と申し上げてもいいかもしれませんが、イギリスの EU 離脱、ブレグジット、あとですね、アメリカの第一次トランプ政権の成立、そしてその後、欧州各国における移民を排斥するような公約、政策を取る政権の成立、またはですね、ファーライト、極右政党の国政選挙における躍進、そういった変化をどのようにご覧になっているかということを改めてお聞きしたいと思います。また、その出来事や変化というものを事前に予測されていたでしょうか。また、もし予測されていなかったとしたら、その主な理由はどのようなものとお考えでしょうか。予見できなかった理由があるとすれば、それは何でしょうか。また最後にですね、この移民政策、移民研究の分野で、ご自身の研究者としてのキャリアをスタートさせた、そういった動機とかきっかけ、そういったものともし絡めて印象深い出来事についてお話しいただければ幸いです。お一人10分ぐらいずつをめどにお答えいただければと思います。これが最初の質問となります。よろしくお願いします。まずはではデハース先生からお願いいたします。Okay, so interpreter is not working well, so I repeat the question. So we have witnessed numerous significant changes in migration policies over the past few decades, which obscure our outlook for the future. Concerns about the rapid increase in migrants and societal rifts are the major driving forces of politics in liberal democratic societies. In the first round of the discussion, I will ask you how you see the recent development on migration policies among liberal democratic societies in the past few decades, including your view based on your history and motivation to start your career in this field as well. So my question, so I summarize my question again. So to Professor de Haas and Professor Joppke, so 10 minutes for each. And so my questions are, so first one is, how do you see the recent developments of migration policies among liberal democratic societies in the past few decades, such as Brexit in 2016 and the first Trump administration in the same year. And after that, so there are many far-right government so elected in European countries. And the second Trump administration started this year. So how do you see these events? So so what is the most impressive event as a migration researcher? So please so refer to these points. And other point is that so could you foresee the events I mentioned so in advance, so before they happen? And if you couldn't foresee these events, why? So we are wondering the reasons. So why you are unable to predict them. So please also refer to your personal history and motivation. You started your career in this field, so migration research, if possible. So yeah, so these are they are my questions. First question to Professor de Haas and Professor Joppke. So so please start. So yeah, from Professor de Haas.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Okay, wonderful. Well, yeah, my personal history started in Morocco, actually. I went to Morocco as a tourist when I was 17 years old to Morocco, and I kept on going back when I was studying geography. And I initially went to Morocco to study agriculture in Oasis in the deep south of Morocco. I was doing environmental geography. I had nothing to do with migration at the time. But when I wanted to understand change in agrarian societies in the deep south of Morocco, I discovered the importance of migration. And I was fascinated more and more by the importance of migration in the day-to-day lives of people living in a country like Morocco. And so from a very early age on, I mean, I did my first fieldwork in Morocco in 1993 and 1994, and I went back for 2 years between 1998 and 2000 for my PhD fieldwork. I learned to see migration from the perspective of origin countries because I was initially doing research on agrarian change, desertification, development in origin countries. So I've always looked at migration from the other side. And that partly explains, I think, my intellectual journey afterwards, because it is quite interesting if you look at migration debates that 80–90% of migration debates are about what it means to destination countries. And that's totally understandable because, of course, we've seen this increase in migration from non-Western countries to Western countries, and it is to be expected to have a debate about it. But I think it is problematic at the same time that we basically disregard the other half of migration, which is the perspective of origin countries. And also the second bias is on impacts. Impacts of migration on destination and to some extent also origin country, but very little attention and knowledge on the actual process of migration, the root causes of migration, how migration is embedded in much deeper changes of societies. And this is really the kind of research I've become involved in more and more, because I think there was a clear research gap there. And this is also how I, in the end, came out with this. I worked on these transitions. I worked in the tradition of Wilbur Zelensky and Ronald Skeldon, and later on myself, I developed this aspiration capabilities model to provide a different and I think more realistic way of understanding how migration is deeply embedded in much bigger social transformation processes. So the fact that I started in an origin country setting, I think partly explains this. And I often cite the Algerian sociologist Abdel Malik Sayed, that every immigrant is also an emigrant, but we often forget that. And I think this is deeply important if we want to understand why policies often don't work the way politicians want them to work, because they're not really based on understanding of what drives migration, what motivates migrants. And this is often why policies are off the mark. And that also allows me to switch to what I think of policies. What is really interesting is that there's a huge gap between the discourse and the practice of migration policy. And I think this gap has been increasing over the last decades. With my team at Oxford University, I run this big project called Determinants of International Migration. And one of the things we've done is to basically measure the evolution of migration policies. We collected 6,500 different policy measures adopted by almost all Western states in the post-war, Second World War context. And then subsequently we coded all those policies in terms of every policy change, is that a change towards more restrictive, more liberal policies. And then we developed an index, and all that information is available in the IMI working paper series. And we published this also in all the journals. Two important findings. First of all, if you look at actual policies, immigration policies have become less restrictive, not more restrictive. Which means that rules for allowing migrants in terms of giving, labor migrants or student migrants or other people, actually states have created more opportunities for workers to come in, not less. So, and that is even true for the last 20 years. Although there has been a deceleration of liberalization, there has not really been a turn into more restrictive immigration policies. I think one example, legal immigration to the United States reached an all-time high under the first Trump administration. And the second finding we observed is that there is no significant difference between right or left-wing governments in their overall restrictiveness of their immigration policies. And this can be explained by two things. First of all, the sort of pro-anti-migration divide runs straight across the political divide because amongst classical left-wing parties, we have the traditional opposition between, let's say, the labor union sort of wing of those parties who've always been very skeptical about the importation of migrant workers from abroad. And of course, we have the more human rights sort of wing, which is advocating for migrant rights. But if you look at the right-wing side, on the one hand, we have cultural conservatives who are quite skeptical or even hostile towards immigration, but we also have a very strong corporate business lobby. And I think this explains a lot of the gap between the image of toughness that politicians want to project, but at the same time, the limitations they face. Professor Joppke himself has written extensively about the legal constraints, of course, the democratic states face to really stop migration, because it's not just about immigration policies, it's also about a broader framework of human rights the states have subscribed to in their own constitutions, but also as part of a whole series of international treaties. But I think the other issue is, and this is where Professor Freeman has written about, this liberal paradox, that you in a way cannot have your open liberal economy and competitive economy, and you want much less immigration. This is very difficult to reconcile. And this is why in my book, I try to put those perspectives together, and by arguing that policymakers face a migration trilemma. You cannot have that open, thriving, liberal market economy and this democratic state which attributes fundamental human rights, and you want to significantly curb immigration. These three objectives are very difficult to achieve at the same time. And I think this, to a large extent, explains why politicians who don't want to face those dilemmas, who want to avoid a real debate about immigration, basically focus on acts of political showmanship. And I think what's happening in the United States is very significant and problematic. But at the same time, I think it's just one more example of politicians who act very strongly, but in the practice, in the longer term in particular, are also under pressure to allow even undocumented migrants to work in all sorts of sectors where their labor has become absolutely essential. So I think this is the real problem, this huge gap between the political narrative, the acts of political showmanship on the one hand, and on the other hand, the lack of real progress where we talk about policy. And this is why despite all the criticisms one may have about the migration pact in Europe, I think it is important that states try to do something together. And I think it is very important that I think this is the only future. that we look at this much more from a collaborative perspective, international perspective. But secondly, and this is the issue I already addressed in my lecture, I think we need a real debate about the future of labor. How are we going to deal with aging in the future? How are we going to, in a way, re-establish the dignity of manual labor? How are we going to deal with aging as not just a matter of immigration, because it's an illusion that migration can fix those issues. So I think these are much more fundamental debates about care in particular, who's going to take care of our children, our sick, our elderly in the future. And these are fundamental debates. I mean, there have already been debates in many Western countries about the end of neoliberalism, that we need a different approach, that the bottom half in terms of income of populations hasn't benefited from globalization and neoliberal policies. I really think we need to address these issues, because this content is not going to go away, and it's only to give room to far-right voices who try to put the blame of all these problems on migrants. But on the other hand, migration is also not going to be the solution. So I think it is really important for that reason that we go beyond the polarized debate we have right now. So I think this is really important to address the discursive gap between the very tough sort of discourses that we hear from politicians, but the lack of actual progress and real courage to have a real debate and about these issues. We all know they exist. So I was talking about this elephant in the room, this hypocrisy we see, and I think it needs to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, next, Professor Joppke, provides yours.
Yeah, 4 questions about each of which I could go on for hours and tell you things that you wouldn't want to hear anyway. So the first one, how do you see recent developments? Well, I think I had an hour to share my thoughts on that, and I will not repeat that. What is the most impressive event for you as an expert in the field in the past few years? Well, it's really 2. Well, 3. First, 2015. What skeptics call the Syrian refugee crisis, and what migration enthusiasts call the long summer of migration. 1 million asylum seekers, many and most from Syria because of the civil war in that country, but also from more remote places in the world, arriving in Germany alone in that year. At first, I thought, fantastic. You know, I'm a child of post-war Germany, and this generation, probably the last of this political sentiment, kind of feeling guilty about the crimes that your fathers and forefathers have committed under the Nazi regime in the mid-20th century. And wasn't it fantastic that now Angela Merkel, the chancellor of the highest political representative, I mean, effectively the highest political representative of the country, welcoming the downtrodden and exploited of the world, you know, Willkommenskultur, wir schaffen das, we will manage that. Perhaps there was no alternative in that particular situation, but I also think it was a terrible mistake to open borders so radically and let that society be overwhelmed. Even though initially the response was very positive, chocolate and ice cream being distributed at the Munich train station when the first Syrians and others arrived from Austria, actually on chartered buses and railways, but very quickly the climate changed very radically. And the rise of the extreme right in Germany, which was kind of dwindling at the 5% hurdle, that is the hurdle required to enter parliament, suddenly they doubled and almost tripled their result, and they had 13% in the next election in 2016, I think it was. Germany was then, in a way, the last country in Western Europe, really, to join the trend of significant and ever stronger radical right parties. And this is purely and exclusively the result of that decision to open borders so radically in that moment. She very quickly withdrew from it and said, no way, mea culpa, apologies, etc. But it was a big mistake, too much openness. And almost simultaneously, the other event, Trump. Trump 1, Trump 2. I wrote about Trump 1 in my first book on the issue, which in a way is my populism book, under that title of neoliberal nationalism, which was really a book about how immigration and citizenship policies are or are not influenced and shaped by the recent radicalization of populist politics at the right end of the political spectrum. Now, that is an atrocity in its own kind and right, what Trump did with separating families. Then his project was that beautiful border. Now it's even worse, what you see in Los Angeles these days, plain civil war. Plain civil war. And you see indeed what Professor Haas denounced as political showmanship in a very big way. Trump was never interested in solving problems, never interested in reforming migration policy. For him, that was from day one just an issue to be polemical about and to radicalize his followers and to completely transform the Republican Party from an honorable mainstream right-center party into an extremist equivalent of radical right parties. So these two events are crazy on the opposite extremes. Too much openness, too much radicalness of restricting and closing. You know, the middle way is my esteemed colleague, lawyer Daniel Thüm at the University of Constance called it humanity and order, a kind of combination of respecting control imperatives that cannot be wished away. We live in a world of nation states in which borders are necessary, and to the degree that the liberal paradox, which I criticized, is valid, the validity of it is, the paradox is that liberalism requires states to implement liberal rules, and states would simply be washed away if border control is mellowed too radically. So yeah, I was a bit too. I still have 5 minutes to go. I am signaled here. Could you foresee the events? Of course not. It's ridiculous to expect of academics to foresee anything. How is the weather? Hold up your thumb. And even weather forecasting gets ever more messed up. I don't know for what reason. No, look, after 1989, there was a similar debate, even in very respectable journals like World Politics. Why didn't all the Sovietologists and experts on communism not foresee what was happening? Because history, to a degree, is just, as Michael Oakeshott, British philosopher, once called it, one damn thing after the other. And to a degree, there is just randomness and contingency. I don't consider my job as a sociologist or a social scientist to forecast, to foresee, and even less to give recommendations. Therefore, in a way, I'm completely misplaced here, in all honesty. I see my job as properly describing things, and if I'm ambitious, perhaps even explaining this or that. But all that is kind of reconstructing in a way. It's backward looking, and that's the job of the academic. It's the job of politicians to have visions and bring new, and of citizens, of course, to design their futures, not of the social scientist. And finally, personal history. How did I get into the field? Originally, I'm a sociologist, and sociologists can do what they like, and they are very often, as me in particular, driven by the zeitgeist, what Germans call the zeitgeist, the burning issues of the day. When I did my doctorate, the zeitgeist was Chernobyl. and 3 Mile Island, the nuclear near explosions of these reactors. And then everybody speculated about the rise of risk society. So I was simply following that trail. I was always an opportunist, following the zeitgeist. And then interest in that ducked down, and migration suddenly was the big issue, also caused by alleged problems of integrating so-called integrating Muslim migrants. And then I changed to that field. And in a way, I wasn't that much quoted on my first 2 books on migration, even though they were written by the same head, either bad or clear-headed. It's for you to judge, but it was the same person. But I started becoming cited and quoted once I wrote about immigration, and you stick with it. I stuck with it because also lifetime is limited. In reality, I would like to be a musician, a jazz musician or something, completely revamp myself, but lifetime is too short. So a very trivial answer for how I got into that field. I never really was a migration scholar, always looked at it from the outside, and now I just stopped before my 1-minute lapses.
Okay, thank you so much. So your stories are very impressive in terms of kind of very serious aspect of the recent developments of migration policy, and at the same time, so from your personal, in terms of your personal history, stories are very stimulating for probably many young scholars here in the room. So thank you so much for sharing your story and views on this issue. Okay, so we'll go to next round of the discussion. So I will ask a more specific question to each of panelists. So, okay, so I will, firstly, I will ask a question to Professor Fala. So, so she's a prominent scholar in migration area, especially she revealed how Japan is a country of immigration by her thick analysis on Japanese society. So I'd like to ask you, based on your recent book, so why do you see Japanese society as an immigrant society, and what are the differences between Japan and other Western immigrant societies, so mentioned in the speeches by keynote speakers? And what points have been overlooked by the mainstream immigration studies, mainly in the United States and recently in Europe? So what do you think are the reasons for the kind of overlooking the kind of important differences between those societies? So floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Dr. Koregawa. And I always appreciate your positive, affirmation of my argument that Japan is an immigrant society. So I think extending from, to Professor's kind of tradition of talking a little bit about myself, I think the reason why I write a book on immigrant in Japan is because I am an immigrant in Japan. And I feel like my status needs to be acknowledged. So do millions of immigrants in this country. If there are legal possibilities for a country to have so many immigrants, it should be considered an immigrant country. So for that, I kind of, in my book, try to redefine what an immigrant country is. It's just basically a country that provides foreign nationals multiple legal channels to enter and legal paths and institutional frameworks for permanent settlement, which Japan qualifies. Although some settler countries such as the US will argue Japan does not issue immigration visa, which means that people can arrive on the shore as permanent residents, but many immigrant societies in the world now don't have that visa. So I think that expectation that you come with immigration visa is anachronistic. Most of immigrant countries are actually a lot like Japan. So I think many immigrant countries in Europe are not so different from Japan. And the other thing that I would like to emphasize that Japan is an immigrant society, as Dr. Kolegawa has demonstrated in his presentation, there's so many immigrants and more to come. So not considering Japan as an immigrant country denies the social and population reality, and also denied the people and very important identity. In Japan, because of its post-war ethno-nationalism, or this ethno-nationalist claim, in the government as well as the public discourses, there's no room for immigrants. There is only Japanese and foreigners. So the immigrants and their children would be permanently foreigners. And this is by definition alienation. So it's not good for the immigrants' sense of belonging to the society, nor for Japan's social cohesion. So I think Japan should consider using the word immigrants and immigration for the sake of its cohesive societal future. So main point of difference between Japan and Western society, obviously Japan did not have a large immigrant intake in the post-war period, as many Western countries did, like in Europe, like the guest worker program. So the immigrant population is comparatively small. It's only 3% right now. Right now, the Asian country is facing very severe labor shortages. So I think unlike some of the Western countries, you have a backlash against immigration. Japan, actually, this bringing foreign labor force is more or less a consensus. It's agreed upon. The question is how Japan can more effectively bring in foreign labor and from where. So it's in a sense, the policy is moving toward the opposite direction to be very liberal, increasingly liberal and largely pragmatic still. So the populist sentiment is still relatively weak. And the other point, going back to Professor Joppke's characterization of contemporary migration policy as a neoliberal nationalist, Japan's immigration can only be considered partially neoliberal, I would say. On the one hand, Japanese immigration policy appears neoliberal. It is utilitarian, viewing immigrants function entirely as a labor force, as a human resources, as workers, right? Not as immigrants, as residents in that sense. But on the other hand, I think this is very specific to Japan's labor market. It still maintains a very a degree of commitment to skill training, to more long-term employment, to job security. So immigration into Japan is essentially a progressive training process. Immigrants are culturally and socially trained in order to enter Japan's labor market. In a sense, Japan sees immigrants as potentially trainable skilled labor. So there isn't this kind of, we need low-wage labor, unskilled labor. No, Japan sees everybody as potentially trainable skilled labor. So I think that actually reflected in the SSW program as a specified skilled workers by using International Labor Organization's definition of skill, which there's no job that does not require skill. Japan essentially expands this skilled labor category, which I think is a really good thing. And so I think what the next question is, what points have been overlooked by mainstream immigration studies in Europe and the United States? What do you think are the reasons for this? I think, I don't know how exclusive this is, but Japan, as many other East Asian countries, have a very strong state intervention in migration policies and also in the migration process. And also, in Japan probably also has to do with the geographic isolation in a sense. It's quite effective in preventing irregular migration. So, and also legal institutionally very effective in preventive measures of irregular migration. And also, this is going back to Professor de Haas' notion of migration is development. I think Japan the immigration to Japan is a very complex, and for example, recently I've been working on this theme of a migratory, transnational migratory space, because the migration into Japan now goes beyond development. So we have to think migration beyond just the development, and a lot of migration into Japan or from Japan actually is not economically oriented at all. So, so this is something I think maybe we can discuss, and why Japan has not been more central to migration studies. I think first of all, obviously Japan's a latecomer, and also the immigrant population is relatively small, and Japan has been considered a negative case of migration by, say, David Bartram, and so Japan is not considered a migration country. So the other is really, it has to do with this small scale of immigration, is this receiving country bias. And so because Japan has not received a lot of immigrants, and the receiving countries, the pioneers were US and settler countries and Europe, so Japan is not under the radar. So it's not substantial enough to make Japan an important case. So when people see Japan in an immigration study journal, they see this as irrelevant, as the exception. That's my experience. And the other thing is really too few, maybe too little scholarship in English from Japan. And in general, I think Asian migration scholarship out of Asia is very small, and according to David Fitzgerald, it's only 6% of all the immigration scholarship produced in English. 6% is based in Asia, and I would say probably 0.6% is in Japan. So I don't know. It is just it's kind of, I was being facetious. So the other thing is studies about Japan's migration often appear in area studies instead of migration journals. So in a sense, I will also use this opportunity to encourage all my colleagues who do migration in Japan to make our case more visible to the international readership. So I think I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, I completely agree with your opinion. As a migrant researcher in Japan, I share many experiences she mentioned. So yeah, exactly. So this event will be a kind of chance to expand our knowledge and our kind of new aspect as a migration country to the world. So I hope. Okay, so we will go to the kind of other side of the globe. So I'd like to go to questions to Professor Mine. So African experiences. So your expertise. So yeah. In migration research, so it's fair to say that apart from remittances and the brain drain, migration has received little attention in the development studies, I think. So, but migration, was thought to be a result of poverty, and it was believed that as development progresses, the number of migrants would decrease. However, African continent is a source of migrants mainly to Europe. And in the keynote speech by Professor de Haas, so it will be source of migrant to other areas of the globe. So, so could you share some memorable episodes that illustrate the relationship between migration and development in your study? So my questions are, so when we think of African immigrants, we tend to think of refugees. And your institute is named by Sadako Ogata, who was the UNHCR, so High Commissioner of UNHCR. So it's very, you was kind of in the right position to speak about the relationship between kind of refugees and migration. So is it possible to understand immigrants and refugees in a unified way? How do you think about it? And Africa is a source of immigrants to Europe, but is it correct to understand the people leaving Africa because of poverty? So provide yours.
Okay, Dr. Koregawa, thank you very much. Yes, I anticipated your question, so I prepared some slides. So let me explain why we, JICA Ogata Institute, hosted this event together with Shajin-ken. So this is because of her. You can see the picture, the Madame Sadako Ogata. So she served as for the United Nations as a UNHCR High Commissioner for Refugee for 10 years in the 1990s. Okay, so after she left the United Nations, before she came to JICA as JICA's president, actually she co-chaired the Commission on Human Security together with the economist Amartya Sen. So they published this report. You can see the slide, Human Security Now, in 2003. So if you are interested, you can just go downstairs of this building. There's Ogata Sadako Gallery. You can find the same picture there. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay. So Ogata Sadako, Madame Ogata, was a champion of the cause of the humanitarian assistance to refugees. But Ogata Sadako and UNHCR not only protected refugees, but also always tried to empower them, respecting their agency, empowering refugees, respecting their dignity and human agency. So the key word of Sadako, of Ogata, and she wanted to bring to the human security agenda is a sort of dignity, okay? Some kind of dignified existence of each and every human being, including refugees. And also Madame Ogata brought Amartya Sen. And Amartya Sen, he represented development side. And Madame Ogata represented humanitarian side. And Amartya Sen was elaborated the theory of capability and human development. And the capability is a kind of the alternative sets of the beings and functionings of beings and doings under some certain personal social settings. But in plain terms, this refers to human development, expanding the range of people's choices. Okay, so the Amartya Sen representing development side. And actually, today's guests, Professor Joppke, actually, I read your book in Japanese, so it's quite natural we wanted to invite you. And Professor de Haas, actually, your theory of aspirations and capability was actually caught our attention because we are advocates of human security, which is a combination of Ogata Sadako's aspiration, idealism, and Amartya Sen's very much, is an economist, but with a warm mind. The capability framework was also the part and parcel of human security approach. Okay, so this is, I'm sorry, it was a bit long, but it is a reason why we invited you and why we were interested in Professor de Haas framework, aspiration, and capability. And then let me quickly talk about Africa as well. 2 more slides. So next one, please. And we often, tend to think migration is from the south to the north, but actually the migration is quite all-encompassing. And this is taken from Human Security Now, the Ogata Sen report. Okay, and actually the chapter 3 is dedicated to the question of migration. And this chapter starts with this statement: most people move to improve their livelihood, seek new opportunities, or escape poverty. They also leave to rejoin family members elsewhere. The reason for moving is forcible displacement or coercion because of war, violent conflict, And also the human security men also at risk when they are migrating. Okay, so the next slide, please. Okay, And the people, many migrants are not necessarily voluntarily moved, but forcibly relocated, displaced. And this is a map of UNHCR's distribution of refugees. And we tend to think refugees are crossing the borders and coming from Africa to Europe, okay, from the poor nations to affluent nations. But in reality, if you look at this map, the most of refugees are actually, in the South, in Africa, in the Middle East. And European refugees from Ukraine tend to be accommodated in Europe, and African refugees tend to be accommodated in Africa. So, okay, this is the map. And the next one, the last one, please. This slide is not narrowly defined refugees, but broadly defined refugees, internally displaced persons. They could not cross the national boundaries, but remained in their own home countries, but the sufferings are exactly the same as those of refugees. And you can see where they live, okay? Is Latin America, from Venezuela, and also the Africa, Central Africa, is quite a lot of internally displaced persons, and also the Middle East and some Europe. But anyway, what I wanted to emphasize is those refugees are mainly accommodated in the neighboring countries. So the African refugees in African countries, Middle Eastern refugees in the Middle East. So is my final, comment is, this is where the development agency like JICA is expected to play a role. Okay, so we should provide assistance to the nations which accommodate those people in distress, displaced, migrants. And okay, so let me quit here. So if you are interested in this kind of the JICA's activities, so please, maybe we should organize another event okay, for the publicity of and the necessity and the priority of our activities. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your insights based on your experiences in Africa. So yeah, it's very it's good to know why you collaborate with our institution to hold this event because so it's just not a collaboration. So I think so our collaboration will produce new knowledge. So based on knowledge you have so in our developing fields in Africa and other global South areas where many immigrants are pushed to destination and the neighboring countries. So your story reveals kind of multifaceted aspect of migration phenomena on the globe. So yeah, I'm very impressed by your story. So thank you so much. Okay, so I will go to next question to Professor de Haas. So in your keynote speech, you explained about the details of capability and aspiration model. And I'm curious about how you think about kind of capability and aspiration of destination people in destination countries. So you mentioned that solidarity will be a key to reconstruct asylum migration policy or a migration policy in destination countries. So how do you think the interplay of the capability of and aspiration of destination countries with those of country of origin? So do you have any idea in this regard? So I think concept of capability is very kind of profound, so very fundamental concept for human beings. So as Sen I argued, so yeah, I'm wondering that point. So if you have any idea in this regard, so yeah, provide yours, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure whether capabilities is the only sort of way to look at this. I think rights is very important in this respect, but of course it's related to capabilities. So very good question, but also sort of begs a very complex answer, but I want to keep it relatively short. But I want to go back to this idea that the way I try to redefine human mobility, and indeed I was very much inspired by the capabilities approach, because I've read Amartya Sen's work extensively, but he's actually never explicitly written about migration. And I thought his framework was very applicable to migration, because this goes really beyond seeing migration as a means to an end, because this is a sort of a conventional way of looking at migration. You know, you move because either you want to flee conflict, which is roughly 10% of all migrants internationally, or you want to join family, or a job, or a degree. And of course, these are very, very important reasons why people want to move, but it is too limited in a way. It's an instrumental view to look at migration. If you start to see migration as an option people have in life, for instance, most people having the right passports, you know, the passports, you know, most Western countries, most young people there just take for granted they can take a gap year and, you know, spend a year in whatever country they want to go to. They often don't even need a visa. If they need a visa, it's very easy to get. So I would say most people living in rich countries have basically global mobility freedom. Now, once you have a freedom, you don't really think about it. You may not even use it. So I often compare this to political freedoms. So if people don't have political freedoms, they may go in the street. They may even be willing to die for it. The moment people get political freedoms, you know, the first democratic election in a former dictatorship often has very high turnout rates, above 90%, but those tend to decrease because people just take for granted their freedoms. And I think this is key if we want to understand the migration obsession that we often see in countries that don't have mobility freedoms, and behavioral responses like Professor Joppke was alluding to, that if there's one opening, you see this now or never migration. I've written about all these sort of unintended effects that people try to cross borders the moment it is possible. But what you also see, so that is, you get these migration hikes that weren't really predicted, that suddenly appear. By the way, it's not really true that Angela Merkel's statement that we can manage it actually was the cause of the huge increase in that summer, but there is a very big literature on this. But of course, German hospitality played a role there. But I don't want to get too much into that discussion. We clearly see those reactions, and this is because we have many populations in the world that are deprived of those basic liberties. And I give the example of Morocco and Spain. Until 1991, until basically the Schengen visas were implemented, Moroccans did not need visas to go to Spain. So what many young Moroccans did was go to Spain, have their gap year, work for a few months or a few years, and they would go back to Morocco, because not many Moroccans saw the point of staying in Spain forever. They rather go back once they earned enough money, they had their experiences. So migration is then also more than just a means to earn money. It's often for young people a sense of adventure, exploring new horizons. But it was on the moment that Spain introduced the visa that permanent settlement started. And now Spain has more than 1 million Moroccan residents. In the same way, increasing border controls in the US turned a largely circular flow of Mexicans into the US into a permanently settled population of 12 million. Japan has lower immigration levels, yes. That the geography of Japan is favorable to prevent, let's say, boat crossings, yes. But studies I've seen also show that overstaying rates are very high in Japan. So we know that the biggest source of illegal migration is not illegal border crossings, but actually overstaying in visas. So a big problem in Japan is that many people who come in legally overstay their visas and become undocumented migrants. So it shows that if there is this disjuncture between the rights framework and people's aspirations, we get those behavioral reactions. Well, is the answer to just open borders? No, I do agree that we live in a system of nation states. What it shows is a complicated issue. So both open and closed border sort of narratives are easy slogans. We deal with a very complex reality. We need sophisticated, nuanced immigration policies that do acknowledge the reality on the ground. And do acknowledge that, indeed, I come back to the issue. If you have this labor shortages, and Japan is a case in point, and there's no recognition on a policy level that there is migration happening. So we have the M word that cannot be pronounced in many countries. In the past, I mean, I remember not, back to the 1980s and 90s, you could still hear many German and Dutch politicians say that we are not an immigration policy country. Well, that reality has overcome. But I think there's a huge problem. If we deny the reality on the ground and we deprive people of the basic capabilities, we get those behavioral responses, which is overstaying, which are unexpected migration hikes, because the reality is not being addressed. And yeah, if we could indeed acknowledge the reality, and for those migrants who we do let in, to give them actually rights, it means we give them the mobility freedoms. I mean, I give you one last anecdote to illustrate it. I once met a taxi driver in Morocco, and he was asking me what I was sitting in one of those long distance taxis, and I was asking him, he was asking me what I was doing. I said, I'm a migration researcher. And then he pulled out his Italian residence permit. And he said, when I got this, I went back. And that is the paradox. So by getting an Italian residence permit, he gained the capability to live where he wants to live. And he actually went back to Morocco because he knew that whenever he wanted to go back again to Italy and earn some money, he could do it. So in a way, we lock up people on the wrong side or the destination side of the border, even many people who would like to go back. And I think this is the biggest conundrum. I mean, Douglas Massey, the most prominent US migration researcher, he has shown this extensively in his work, how the unintended effects of policies and the deprivation of capabilities of migrants lead to those unfortunate situations we see right now, which are also fodder for the extreme right. So I think this is an issue to be addressed, and the complexity of migration and the realization that migration is just more than a means to an end. People see it as a fundamental sort of freedom they aspire to. I think will keep on, will lock us in this vicious cycle in which we are. I hope this kind of gives a response to your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. So yeah, it's true. So kind of discursive gap, and so yeah, my understanding is that so people in destination countries kind of have the full capability, and they don't notice what they have. But so which will lead to kind of discursive gap between kind of asymmetrical kind of capability conditions, situations between country of origin and destination countries. So I think it is one of the kind of reasons for kind of discursive gap in destination countries, and it's deeply relevant with the asymmetrical capability conditions between those two areas.
Yeah, I think it's the systematic denial of reality which is problematic. So this is not about opening borders or everybody come. It's really about acknowledging a reality on the ground. And I think, and also go beyond this idea that if you would facilitate mobility, it would necessarily lead to a massive influx. I think on both sides of the debates there are these. I mean, I can give another example. I mean, if you allow, if I still have some time.
Yeah, of course, yeah, you can.
Yeah. I mean, there is this example of Suriname, which is a former colony of the Netherlands in South America. And when Suriname became, actually the Dutch government pushed independence because the Dutch government back in the 1970s saw independence as the only way to stop free migration to the Netherlands. So they in a way pushed the country into independence, because it was only by taking away the Dutch citizenship that the free migration could prevent it. But that triggered a huge migration wave. More than 40% of the entire population went to the Netherlands before the deadline, which was independence and then the introduction of visas. Brexit is another good example. So, I mean, Brexit, I forgot to answer that, I think, in the first round. Brexit was, I mean, it sounded like a logically coherent reasoning from the Brexit sort of front. They said, well, the only way we can stop free inflows from Eastern Europe is to leave the European Union. It was a reverse case of pushing Suriname out of the Dutch kingdom. So it was the only logical, it sounded a logically coherent reasoning. The only way we can stop free migration from EU citizens is no longer being part of the European Union. But then after Brexit, migration quadrupled to the United Kingdom, partly because Eastern Europeans understood that their freedom, their mobility freedoms were being taken away. It stimulated a permanent settlement in the United Kingdom instead of the other way around. It was, people hoped it would trigger their return. It did exactly the opposite. Again, I think those kind of policies are not based on a real understanding of how migration works, and particularly not about how those migration capabilities are valued by migrants and how it often leads to behavioral responses. That means more permanent settlement, more illegality, and all of these kind of things in a situation where the labor demand was still there. So we see a policy that is not really based on a real understanding of migration. And I think the capabilities sort of framework could be useful if we try to understand how migrants see migration and how people in origin countries consider migration. So I also gave this example of Moroccans who circulated to Spain but stopped circulating and started to overstay their visas. And this was also the start of the trans-Mediterranean illegal migration, which has never stopped ever since. And this is also why I think those policies are bound to fail as long as we have this political hypocrisy and as long as we don't acknowledge the reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so yeah, your story tells a lot about how we should think about interplays between policy making and the capability of people. So in many cases, we lack that viewpoint to make a policy. So yeah, it's very insightful. Thank you so much. Okay, and the last but not least, so next question is Professor Joppke. So as Professor de Haas mentioned, so yeah, there's a very strong discursive gap stemming from the kind of asymmetry of the capability and the gaps. So kind of lack of knowledge on interplay between capability of people and policy making. So, but so you describe in keynote speech that neoliberal migration policies, which seem completely disconnected from people's real lives and choices. So I believe it is this very disconnection that impacts everyone, not just migrants, but also citizens, and fuels the deep divide a rift between the populist right and the liberal left. This brings us to a central paradox. So many people are very unhappy with these policies, yet they remain the global mainstream. So why do migration policies continue to become more neoliberal, even when so many people are not happy with them? And this might sound like a kind of contradiction, but is it possible for neoliberal migration policy to become a true outlet for this kind of frustration and anxiety? And if possible, I would also appreciate your comments on the potential for public sentiment to become a source of resistance to this neoliberalization. So this is a question to Professor Joppke.
I would question the premise of your question. The premise being that neoliberal migration policies seem completely disconnected from people's, and assuming it's more natives, real lives and choices. I don't think that's the case at all. Not everything about contemporary migration policies in Western societies is neoliberal. That's one aspect of it, which is ever more foregrounded. But they're also very liberal. This is what Professor Haas has very prolifically with his team written about, that globally speaking, migration policies as selection policies have become more inclusive and more liberal, more welcoming of migrants, and this is what ordinary people don't like. They rant against the liberal aspects of contemporary migration policies, being too friendly and too open to migrants, not against their neoliberal aspects. Neoliberalism can be very restrictive. Populists today rarely, unless it's the Donald, of course, use racial imagery because that is outlawed in polite society. They talk strictly neoliberal. If you look at an earlier program of the Alternative for Germany, the radical right party in Germany, they were very neoliberal. They were even quoting Friedrich Hayek. They were intrigued by two different models of migration. Model Canada, selecting only high-skilled people. They have no problem with that because they are no cost factor. They're productive, they contribute. And they endorsed the model Australia. That is dealing with asylum seekers and presumably other less welcome migrants simply by out-farming their processing to remote islands and letting them rot in very inhumane conditions. So neoliberalism and the populist right have a lot of similarities. The restrictive impulse is at home in both of them, and to the degree that official racism is outlawed, populists and radical rightists use neoliberal language. Also, the Donald is very neoliberal. He's also intrigued before he wanted to make Canada the 51st state of the Union about model Canada, namely high-skilled migration on the basis of a point system. But he's very nervous about what he considers the cost factors, which of course is fully couched in racialist image in his case. But this is neoliberal reasoning. And in my previous book, I call it stemming the unwanted with the border and with now police raids, deporting them, Donald II, and rolling out red carpets, soliciting the high-skilled. The Donald, the populist, is the living incarnation of neoliberal migration policy, if you like. Now, in the end, if I may still respond to that last point, is there the potential for public sentiment to become a source of resistance to this neoliberalization? Well, no, I don't think so, because to the degree that public sentiment gives rise to right-wing populism, this is very much in line with the restrictive side of neoliberalization. And grosso modo, I wrote an entire book about political neoliberalism to make sense of a lot of political developments happening mostly in Western developed societies. And I hate it. I'm very twisted. I'm a Neanderthalian liberal. I always considered myself liberal, but I hate neoliberalism. But in the end, is there an alternative in an open society to become ever less social democratic and ever more individualistic and responsibilizing the individual for the life choices that they undergo? I don't think so. There is no alternative. Margaret Thatcher called it that way. She called it, there's no alternative to neoliberal policies. Of course, she meant it more in a narrowly political economy sense. TINA principle, it has been called after her. And I think there's great wisdom to that. Sorry for being a bit long.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I have no words to say about the kind of the possibility of public sentiment to the kind of reaction, rise of the reaction to the neoliberalism. So, but yeah, it's okay. So we should come up with kind of new ideas to solve the situation in the future. Okay, so we go to the questions from the floor and the online. So, okay, I've just picked up a few questions. Okay. First question is that okay. So it's a question about the public sentiment, especially anti-migrant public sentiment. Especially the situation of Japan, so future situation of Japan. So first question is okay to Professor Fowler. So how do you think about the rise of anti-migrant sentiment in the future in Japan based on your research? And so how do you think about the kind of possibility of narratives, new narratives to solve kind of possible rise of the anti-migrant sentiment in Japan in the future? So yeah, so provide yours.
Thank you for the questions, and these are tough questions. As Christian says, they can't predict future. But if the West countries are the presidents, I think we'll cross our fingers, and that Japan is not going to reach that stage. I think I'm a little bit anxious about the future, because as Japan needs a lot of immigrants. So far, I think the public has the consensus that we need foreign workers, but to what degree, whether some of the, when the population reaches a certain percentage, certain tipping point, will the anti-immigration sentiment become stronger and trigger some populist movement? So I really do not know. So far, Japan is relatively peaceful, very civil when it comes to this sort of immigration. And this demographic crisis is striking the population very strongly. And people realize how much Japan is going to rely on immigration. And otherwise, it's not sustainable. I just hope that this kind of idea will be more accepted and more recognized by Japanese people. One kind of refrain I oftentimes hear from Japanese people is like, I'm not against immigrants. I know Japanese society is not ready for immigrants, but I personally, I'm okay. I hope everybody thinks that way, and so there won't be this so-called abstract Japanese society that will be against immigration. But this is just my personal kind of hope, and I hope Japan has been conservative. I hope it's conservative in reaching that kind of a populist state that will be more civil in this transition. But I really cannot say. And yeah, I think it's just Japanese society needs to change the narratives about immigration, as Professor de Haas also mentioned. There's this hypocrisy in denying that Japan is an immigration state already. And so Japan has a lot of foreign worker policies. So the labor is not controversial. Accepting labor is not controversial, but accepting immigrants is still a kind of a little bit of an ideological challenge. So I'm sorry, this is a non-answer, but I think we really need to propagate the idea that Japan needs immigrants. And maybe Japan has been a kind of exceptional case when it comes to accepting immigration. So I don't know, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm also wondering, how should we kind of separate ethno-nationalistic image of our society and the institutional settings you mentioned as a definition for immigrant society. So I'm always thinking how we can separate these two factors. So at this moment, they are deeply intertwined with each other, and it's hard to separate them. So
I think this national identity thing, this ethno-nationalism, actually is not that, it does not have such a strong hold. I mean, this is a post-war invention. So I think it's going to change as well. Right now, I think Japanese organizations, from my understanding, and are trying on this diversity approach. I think this is just a kind of starting point when you accept that the society or organizations are increasingly diverse in many ways. I think it's going to accept, non-Japanese or immigrants more easily. So I think Japan, I think my understanding of Japan or my experience of a Japanese organization is a very pragmatic. It's not that the nationalism is the only ideology that has been kind of floating and restricting a lot of policy making, controlling people's imagination. But in reality, people are accepting a lot of diversity. So pragmatically, people are taking this reality in. It's just, in terms of discourse, hasn't reached this political discursive level, which I think I had a conversation with some officers of some ministries, and they are waiting for the public sentiment to tip so they could actually introduce that kind of a discourse. So it's really about a pragmatic approach. That's my take on the development.
Thank you so much. So yeah, there's a kind of hope for future. Yeah, I think so Japanese society is very pragmatic, and so people are kind of easily to reactive and flexible to new reality if it kind of brings us some kind of pragmatical benefit. So yeah, I think it's a kind of a hope for future. Okay, so next question from the online and floor is okay. So it's a question to Professor Joppke. And so question is that in your view, does the current form of neoliberal migration policy represent a long-term shift in liberal democratic values, or is it a temporary political response to global pressures? And how do you interpret the liberal paradox when applied to countries like Japan, where both the identity and economic access of migration remain relatively restrictive? It's a question from online.
I think, and I already indicated that Japan right now is in a situation that a lot of Western European countries, including Germany, but not alone, found themselves in about the 1990s, when this old notion, we are not immigrant societies and we don't want guest workers, was fading into the background because of, economic need for high-skilled and also, of course, to a degree, particularly in Southern Europe, low-skilled labor, and because of the dramatic demographic reality of shrinking birth rates. So Japan is in that moment that, say, Germany was in the 1990s, and what direction did Germany take with respect to labor migration? Interestingly enough, the whole first enthusiasm was exclusively about high-skilled people. The first scheme, the so-called green card scheme under Schröder-Fischer green-red government, was giving a limited number of visa for IT specialists, pretty much explicitly targeting computer freaks from India, from the fabled Bangalore. Over time, however, there was a realization that the German economy does not just need these high flyers, super trained technical specialists, but also what is called in German Fachkräfte, and that is skilled workers. And the last labor law reform actually was to also open up Germany more for people who do crafts, plumbing, carpeting, fixing roofs, etc. So evermore there's a realization that you cannot just focus on high-skilled people because the economy also has a need for other types of labor migrants. And here I think the Japanese can actually teach the Germans something, that this strict division between Fachkraft, highly skilled, is perhaps not the holy grail. I find the very interesting development in Japan is not to do, as Takeshi calls it, not a selecting model, either high-skilled or low-skilled. Okay, you may be fairly open to both and you do better on that account, but he calls it a cultivating model in which you give low-skilled people the chance over their lifetime actually to improve their skill level and thereby also their income and their social status in society. I find that a very interesting idea, which of course doesn't fall from the sky, has to do with your different labor system, which is lifelong employment in Europe. Totally gone in one firm, totally gone in Europe. It's all flexibilized, all neoliberalized. The Japanese should beware of that. And there is really a lot of wisdom and value in this model of to spend your life in one company with all the loyalties involved, but then the company also being responsible for the workers, be it citizen or foreign workers increasingly, to give them a chance to increase their standing within the company. I think it's a model that I don't think you can, actually, this is not a lesson for Germany, it's phony because they have a different economic structure, a different corporate structure. I'm very skeptical that countries can learn from one another. Of course, it's very interesting to get the experience of other countries, but more as a negative foil to see how specific you are and perhaps how you should not do things and then do them right because of your own homegrown experiences and your own acquired wisdom.
Okay, thank you so much for your answers to my questions. So okay. So we are now okay. So there's 10 minutes left until the end of the session. So we will go to the final round of the discussion. So I'd like to ask questions on the future. So of course, Professor Joppke mentioned that it's impossible to foresee the future by academia, but I dare to ask a question. I'd like to break down my questions to more detailed items. So my question is, what will be the key factor to see the future development of migration policy? And if possible, please talk about the specific scenarios you have come up with at this moment. So for the future development of migration policy over the next 10 to 20 years. So it should be, it might be pessimistic, disappointing one, or there's probably some hope. So of course, I'd like to ask you about any hope kind of to change the kind of pessimistic scenario if you have. So so I'd like to ask you, all of you, 5 minutes or 5 minutes for each. Okay, so first to Professor Mine.
The future is unpredictable, but still demographic change is relatively predictable. So the Japanese shrinking population, and also some years ago, I wrote a book in Japanese and in English on the demographic change and implications for global society. But so in this context, let me quickly show another slide. If I may, it's about the migration. The next one, please. Next one. The next slide. So yes, actually the last night I quickly crafted this graph based on the United Nations population divisions, the migration stock. And you can see the red line is actually the migration trend in the past from south to south. So the around 2000, there was a stagnation. It's basically, it's probably because of the Asian financial crisis. But you can see the rising trend of the migration within the south. Okay, it's followed by a little bit less, but from north to south. And in the parallel one is the Africa. Is you can also look at this below dotted line. The migration within Africa is actually a majority case, and followed by the from Africa to Europe. So this is, I think, the reality. So the next slide, please. So and actually this is a trend, the past, and I think we can also focus on the global context. So the intra-region migration is quite important. So the JICA Research Institute, Ogata Institute, we are planning to launch a new research project on human security and migration in Africa. So please looking forward to the research outcome. And the last slide, please. So actually, I was supposed to give some episode or something. So actually, this is taken from the narrative of my interview. It's given by my friend from Zimbabwe. So it's quite interesting. Somebody asked him, so why did you migrate from Zimbabwe to Japan? And he answered, I always feel that this is not a one moment, like, okay, this happened and I decided, but I think that is like an aggregate of decisions starting from my young age. So we tell people to dream. So we can only dream as far as our imagination can take us, and sometimes our imagination is limited. So I imagine me, 10 years old, okay, Zimbabwean boy. I was in rural areas in a farm, and I was taking care of my grandfather's goats. And at that moment, I didn't have a dream to come to Japan, but I used to look at the mountain and wondered what lies beyond that mountain. So I wanted to go and see while tending to the goats. And I wanted to go more, discover more. This was a motivation, and eventually he came to Japan. And now he is teaching at a Japanese university, as an African lecturer. So this is his life. So it's quite interesting. And I want to, make our research rooted in the reality. So the collecting narratives from the migrants is quite important, becoming quite important research method. And so we are now trying to do it by Africans and for Africans. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so yeah, it's quite interesting and so amazing. Yeah. Okay, so next question. So yeah, I mentioned 5 minutes for each, but sorry, I was mistaken. So there's only 8 minutes left. So okay, so 2 to 3 minutes for each. Okay, so next is Gracia.
Okay, I don't want to use 2-3 minutes. I just want to say, I don't know about in 20 years, but in 10 years, I think Japan, at least, or Asia, East Asia, is still going to have this sort of contract-based, temporary-based labor migration policy, and it's just going to be writ large in the sense that expanding the programs because of the demographic imbalance, and also still around Japan, Korea, Taiwan, there are still countries who lagging behind in economic development and the conflicts as well. So we'll be still sending labor to these countries. I see this trend continuing, and but I don't know after 10 years how things are going to pan out, because I think the economic discrepancies are going to reduce. But at the same time, with the accumulative kind of causation. I don't want to use that word, but accumulative, with accumulation of all those ties and infrastructures establishment, I think East Asia is going to be much more, hopefully more freely mobile for people. So in a sense, reduce the kind of barriers that Professor de Haas has mentioned. I see this as increasingly a kind of transnational labor market shaping here. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next is Professor de Haas.
Yeah, I'll keep it really short. I mean, again, we cannot predict the future. I think it is very likely that we are entering the age of African migration. I think we've just have seen the age of Asian migration, with Asian migrants basically going all across the world. So because of development, I think it's almost inevitable that Africa will, which has been quite limited migration from Africa on a global scale, like it's out of the continent, that is very likely to increase because of development, basically. So I think an increasing share of global migration will be about Africans. I think that is the only sort of prediction I dare to make. In terms of where people will go to, I think that it very much depends on economic trends. I mean, I've sometimes joked that the best way to really bring down migration is to wreck your economy. So I think it's quite likely in the short term we'll see declining migration to the United States if everything that's happening right now will probably be bad for economic growth in the US. And we just know that also means less immigration. But apart from that, it's very difficult to predict. I think there's now inevitability where policies could go. We could go an increasing trend indeed of, let's say, if I can adopt that term, neoliberalization of economic immigration policies, like we're seeing in the US. But I think it's not inevitable at all. I think we've seen positive development as well, growing recognition of different migrant categories, there's a growing global efforts, not just in the European Union, but also in the Asian region, in Africa, in Latin America, to create free mobility zones. So I think there are definitely on a regional level, there are encouraging developments. This cannot be done overnight. I also think the Asylum Pact in Europe at least is one step forward. And the last thing I wanted to say, so there's nothing inevitable. It depends on politics. And the other thing I want to say, a reason for optimism is perhaps that public opinion is more stable about migration than we often think. It is not true that there has been a sudden shift in public opinion against immigration. There's always been a fair share of Western populations that are either cynical or hostile on immigration, but in the past they didn't have a political home, and I think that's the main thing that has changed. If you look at long-term trends, things are much more stable, and there is still a fair share in Western populations that either have mixed feelings about migration or moderately positive ones, but the idea there is no potential to have a real debate about real issues, I think, is basically false. So that also means there's reason for optimism, but I think there's a big reason for concern if we see developments right now in the United States and other countries around the world and the rise of the far right. So I think these things really have to be addressed. So yeah, that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, and last but not least, so yeah, question.
I don't want to have a last word here. I think the main challenge for migration policy, if you can make this lump sum generalization, and this is from a European perspective, the main challenge for migration policy is outside of its domain. The main challenge for it is to contribute to help contain the rise of the radical right, which turns out to be a real threat to liberal democracy. Trump won. I kind of smiled about it to a degree, but I was not affected. It was comedy, right? And entertainment on end. Trump too is dangerous. Trump too is ultra dangerous to liberal democracy. And to a degree, Trump's support is drawn by his craziness about migration, polemicizing about migration. So I think one has to take the concerns of those who vote for Trump and other radical right parties serious. Unless there's order at the border, you will not contain this virus, which is a very dangerous virus, to repeat. And I don't think that I agree with Hein de Haas saying, yeah, this political showmanship, in reality, it's all about labor. I don't fully agree about that, that it's all about labor. There's a real cost to asylum seeking that is kind of uncontrolled. It is a cost factor. 50% of all social aid recipients in Germany today, 50% are foreigners, and many of them are asylum seekers from Ukraine, rather wanted, from the Middle East and Northern Africa, rather less wanted. So there's an issue. Order at the border. Migration policy cannot deny that imperative.
Okay, thank you so much for all of your answers for my last final question. Okay, so it's time to finalize. So end the session. Okay, so thank you so much. All panelists. So so it ends.